Latin, the Latin language learning podcast from London, England.
When I first started to study Latin, I had a great deal of difficulty sorting out the issue of syllables long by position, simply because in many texts the Macron was being used to show a long syllable when in fact the vowel in that syllable was a short one, and the system only worked, of course, if you knew what was going on. Also, the rules for syllabification of how you divide up the words in Latin are different for speaking than for writing, and so if you were to look in the grammar books, they would give you rules which wouldn't apply for speaking Latin out loud. So what I've done is I've taken material from a number of different sources, and primarily Bennett is the main influence here, and written an article on reading Latin prose and reading Latin poetry. The article is also online, and you can follow the link below. If you go to the actual podcast website attached to this article, there will be a link to the website so you can read the article. Poetry in Latin is quantitative. This means that the poetry depends for its effect on the length of the syllables relative to one another, and only secondarily, if at all, on the actual word stress. By contrast, English poetry depends for its effect almost exclusively on word stress. Right? I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high, etc. Wordsworth. What I can remember of it off the top of my head, anyway. 'Twas mimsy and the slithy toves did, etc. From Jabberwocky, right? Da 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 da. Stress. Now, there are two types of syllables in Latin. There are syllables that end in a vowel, and syllables that don't end in a vowel. And there's a third group, so to speak, because they can be either one or the other, depending on the need of the poet. And these either-or syllables are called common syllables. Syllables that end in a vowel are called open syllables, and those that end in a consonant are called closed syllables. How are these syllables made? The Romans, when they were speaking, opened up a syllable if the vowel was followed by only one consonant. So the Romans preferred having open syllables. If there was one consonant that was closing the syllable, they would detach that consonant and move it forward so it would join the following syllable, and the end result was that the syllable was open. For example, pater can become pater. So pat-er, pater. I'll say that again. Pat-er, the first syllable is closed, and pater, it's open. This also happens if a vowel is followed by a mute in combination with l or r. L and r belong to a class of consonants that are called liquids. And the mutes are v, b, p, f, which are the labials, because they all are pronounced with the labia, with the lips. V, B, P, F. And the Romans, certainly in earlier times, pronounced that F quite furiously, like that. But in later times, it had become a slightly more gentle sound. Then we have G, K, and Qu, which is really just K. These are gutturals. And we have D and T, which are linguals, because they are made with the tongue. D and T. So a syllable that has a mute, that's one of these, V, B, P, F, G, K, Q, D, T, followed by a L or a R, opens up the syllable. A syllable that ends in a vowel that has a short vowel in it can be understood in a way to be shorter than an otherwise identical syllable, in other words, one containing the exact same letters, that ends in a consonant, by the simple fact that it has fewer letters, and so it is short. Pa is shorter than pat, because pa has got 2 letters and pat has got 3. Pa takes less time to say than pat, for obvious physical reasons. It's then very important in Latin to pronounce the entire syllable with the correct vowel length, and also to state every letter and pronounce every letter in the syllable. If the vowel length is wrong, then the syllable becomes mangled from a long syllable to a short syllable, and vice versa. Now, this would be sufficient to completely destroy a poetical reading, and because it does destroy the poetical reading, we know which syllables were long and which were short, and which vowels were long and which were short. By looking at Roman poetry, we can see which syllable lengths the poet was using, and so we can work out what the stresses and the vowel lengths were, particularly the vowel lengths, were in Latin poetry and in Latin speech. So getting the syllable length wrong would be sufficient to destroy a poetical reading, or certainly ruin the intended sound of the passage that relies for its effect on the syllabic structure of the sentence, or the turn of phrase that's being used in a speech, for example. Now, 2 syllables with short vowels that differ only in that one has a consonant at the end and the other does not share, as I said, a fundamental, very evident difference. One is physically shorter, and the other is, by comparison, physically longer. That is assuming they have the same letters. We're comparing 2 syllables that are the same. Otherwise, so it has more letters, and as an object, it's longer than if it had 2 letters. So, as I said before, pa versus par. And here again we can see the importance of trilling your R's. If we were to say pa and par in an English pronunciation, there'd be no distinction between PA and PAR, because we say pa and par, and they almost are the same. But a Roman would say pa and par. We don't know if they trilled their R's, but we do know that they pronounced them. So it would be pa and par, or pa and par in a French pronunciation of your R, but the R is pronounced. It's vital that the entirety of a syllable is fully pronounced. As I said, if the R on par were not pronounced distinctly, then a long syllable could easily become to sound like a short one. And this is one of the reasons why readers of restored classical pronunciation of Latin take great care to trill their R's. And of course, if you have 2 R's, one will belong to the first syllable and one will belong to the second syllable, and so you have quite an extensive amount of trilling going on. When does a syllable become long when reading Latin? An open syllable automatically becomes long when it is followed by two consonants, the exception being if it's a mute and a liquid, when it's optional. So an open syllable becomes long when it's followed by two consonants. What happens is that the first of the two consonants detaches and sticks to it. So the open syllable then becomes long because it now has got more letters in it. It's physically longer and it must be pronounced fully. So here we have, for example, tem, pe, statibus, and the tem, pe is open, followed by two consonants, sta, gives us tempestatibus. Tempestatibus, and not tempestatibus. Pe is short and open. Pes is longer and closed because it has a s on the end. And because pes has got more letters in it than pe, it takes longer to say, and so we say it is long by position. It's a syllable that is long by position. It's become long because a consonant has been positioned against it, or it's long because it's in the position before two consonants. So it's long by position. It doesn't mean it has a long vowel. So the syllable is called long by position, and as I said, one way to understand this is that you have positioned an extra consonant against it, and so it's become longer. Here are some more examples. Sti, herpis, becomes stirpis. Dis, ke, sit, becomes dis, kes, sit. Modestus is modestus. Eductus is eductus. Double consonants. You will have been told in your Latin classes that the Romans pronounced double consonants double. And the reason for this is that each consonant in a double consonant ends up in a separate syllable. So it's not a mere fancy when we are told that the Romans pronounced their double consonants as two distinct sounds, or separated them in some way, like penna, not penna. They did, because each letter of a double consonant ends up in its own syllable, according to the rule that we have just discussed. When you have an open syllable followed by two consonants, one of the consonants detaches and attaches to the vowel, and so we separate the two consonants into two separate syllables. A, pa, ra, bat is how we would pronounce it if we didn't know any better, and how we would pronounce it if we were pronouncing it as an English person. Aparabat. However, we have a double P, and so what happens is we get up-pa-ra-bat. Up-pa-ra-bat. Now, the Romans also didn't aspirate their consonants when they were followed by consonants, and that's quite hard to do if you're English. You have to concentrate on it quite a lot. Up-pa-ra-bat. When reading Latin, getting the syllabic structure correct is vitally important. Otherwise, it's impossible to read Latin verse with any degree of authenticity. And you need to nurse these habits when reading prose as well. Otherwise, the transition to reading verse will be very hard, in fact, almost impossible. But if you get it right from the very beginning, then reading Latin poetry will be as easy as picking up a book of English poetry and reading that. It just follows naturally from the order of the words on the page. We'll now pause for a brief message from our sponsor. Common syllables. What is a common syllable? Common syllables only occur when a short vowel is followed by a mute plus a liquid, which is a L and a R. Now, in the ordinary course of things, a mute plus liquid combination behaves like a Siamese twin, and they joined, as it were, at the hip. They function like they are a unit. In other words, they function as though they were one consonant and not two. Now, the poet has the option of performing an operation and separating these Siamese twins. Once they are separated, then they behave like any two consonants, and one of them will then move in the same way we saw above, and will close, and therefore lengthen the syllable immediately in front of the two consonants. But as a general rule, a mute plus a liquid doesn't split. So when we are speaking Latin and we have a mute plus liquid combination, we don't split it. But a poet sometimes will split it for poetic effect. So, patrem is the natural syllabification of the word. Patrem. Tr is a mute plus a liquid, and that's what we expect. Patrem. But the poet, if he wants to, for the effect or the rhyme of his poem, can change the structure to patrem. Not patrem, but patrem. How do we know which of the two the poet has chosen? I mean, it's not going to tell us. The word will just be patrem written out on the page. The only way to know is to read the verse aloud, and when we come to the word, it should be apparent whether it needs to be read as a short syllable or a long syllable, according to the meter of the verse. This takes some practice, and I am not that good at it myself. I have to, when I read Latin poetry, certainly mark all the vowel lengths down. I can't yet do it by ear, but we're heading there. Syllable quantity. There's a great source of confusion, especially to the beginning student, because the Macron, that's that long line above a vowel that tells you it's long, and a breve, which tells you that it's short, is used in poetry to mark out the quantity of syllables. Now, a Macron over a long syllable doesn't mean that the vowel is long. So a Macron over the a in patrem doesn't make it into patrem, but it does turn it from patrem into patrem. Now, this is fine for a speaker with native level fluency or someone who's got a good ear for Latin and who has an instinctive knowledge of the true lengths of the vowels, which would develop and does develop if you are very careful about your pronunciation and your vowel length from the start, but very few people are. Then, for a modern second language speaker, the system of marking a syllable long with a macron above its vowel spells disaster because it adds unnecessary complications. While it's true that Latin versification depends on the syllable quantity, the vowel quantities of the words do not change. The Romans didn't muck around with the length of their vowels. They did move consonants around to change syllables from short ones to long ones, but they did not muck around with the length of their vowels. Short vowels are short, and long vowels are long, and that is the way it is. So, syllables with short vowels are either physically long, in other words, they either have more letters in them, or they are physically short, they have fewer letters in them. Syllables with long vowels are always long. You don't have short syllables that have got long vowels in them. So, pa is long, and so is pab. Pa and pab are both long. Pa and part are both long. Even though one has got more letters than the other, the vowel is so long that the extra bit of sound that comes from the consonant doesn't really make much difference. This type of vowel is called naturally long, or long by nature. And even in a physically short syllable, in other words, it's got two letters like pa, it's still long by nature. And so when you read about vowels being long by nature, it means that or syllables being long by nature, it means that the syllable has a long vowel in it. A syllable that's long by position, however, has a short vowel, but the consonant has been shifted to it. So syllables that have short vowels, pa, for example, is physically short, pad is physically long. Placing a macron above pad to tell us that it's longer than pa simply invites you to say pad and lengthen the vowel when it is the syllable that's long and not the vowel that is long. Even worse, it leads people to think that long by position means that the vowel is lengthened. And this is a not uncommon error. In fact, it's found in several textbooks, and it's found in several online resources that try to explain this matter as well. The use of the macron above the vowel of a syllable, that is long by position, gives rise to much confusion, because the same notation is used for vowel length. It is not the case that a syllable that is long by position, i.e. one containing a short vowel that's followed by two consonants, has its vowel lengthened. Vowels do not change their lengths. So marking it with a macron only gives rise to confusion, especially in a student reader who doesn't have an instinctive appreciation for vowel length and doesn't have this huge bank of words and how they're supposed to sound in his head or in her head, but when reading relies on the macrons, or certainly can be thrown off course by the macrons. Macrons should be used to mark long vowels, and they should be used to mark long vowels only, and they should not be used to serve any other purpose. Some educators have proposed a super macron, which would go over the entire syllable above the macrons and breves. This is okay if you're writing by hand, but you can't really do this on a word processor or for HTML on the internet. What's easier to do, and what I recommend that you do if you are marking up a Latin text for reading, is to keep the vowel quantities marked on top of the line of text, and to mark the long syllables with an underline. So you put another macron underneath the entire lengthened syllable cluster as an underline, leaving the original vowel quantities on top so you don't muck them up. And that will help you read Latin poetry much more accurately. And that's pretty much the end of this discussion. And have a go at reading Latin poetry. There's a good little book by Bennett, which is available online, which is a good introduction to reading Latin poetry. But any text that's marked up will help. But the problem is, if it's marked up using macrons and the vowel lengths have disappeared, then the text will be quite hard for you to use as a beginning student. It's probably better for you to get a text that hasn't got the vowels, short and long, marked in yourself if you need them, and then underline the long syllables. And that will probably get you along the road much, much faster. Also, to develop your ear, it's very important to listen to examples of Latin poetry read aloud and to repeat out loud after the poet. After all, the Romans, when they wrote their poetry, did it mostly by ear. They had their rules, but when a poet's writing a poem, he's not consulting his rule book. He has an instinctual feeling for the rhythm of his language, and his poetry then comes out from that. And so we find that the poems don't perfectly fit the rules all the time, because the poet is using the rules to create a work of art. He's not writing a computer program. On the Latinum website, we have quite a number of examples of Latin poetry being read aloud for you to listen to, and I would advise you to listen to these examples. They are of varying quality because they're from a number of different sources. Those marked VN are probably the best, but Matt Dillon's, Robert Sonkowski's, Deitz's work, there are a large number of selections that are of very good quality, and have a sort of trundle around on the website and download a few of the poems and start listening and get your ear used to the sound of Latin poetry.